Good evening and welcome back to our Bible study on the book of Daniel. Tonight we're going to be covering the 5th chapter of Daniel. And if you remember previous classes, we talked about the word able and how that serves to be a key word within this book. For at least the first 10 chapters, we see the word able and how God is the one who is ultimately the source of all capability, and how men of God have capabilities that other men do not. And within the first chapter, we saw that very clearly with King Nebuchadnezzar, and how Daniel was one who was resolved to not defile himself with the king's food in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. And then in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and no one was able to interpret that dream except for Daniel. And then in chapter 3, we get this interesting portrayal of the fiery furnace, and how the narrative of Daniel breaks away from Daniel a little bit, and we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they go into this fiery furnace. They go into the fiery furnace bound. And yet King Nebuchadnezzar, upon watching this, he sees 4 men, rather than 3, walking around unbound within this fire. And then we get to Daniel chapter 4, where King Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And in this dream, he realizes that there is no one who is able to interpret this dream except for Daniel. And so Daniel comes and he rises up to the occasion and he interprets the dream. And then King Nebuchadnezzar kind of gets full of himself, thinking that he is the end-all, be-all, greatest king in the world. Well, apparently he forgot his first dream, because in Daniel chapter 2, 44 and 45, we realize that there is going to be a kingdom that shall never be destroyed in future days. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar, full of himself, starts to speak how great his kingdom is and how mighty he is and how great this majesty he has. And while the words were still in his mouth, the text says, the Lord spoke to him and humbled himself to where King Nebuchadnezzar fell down on the ground, and he started eating grass like an ox. His hair grew out as long as eagle's feathers, and his fingernails grew out as well. And so we realize that King Nebuchadnezzar was humbled very quickly by the power of God. Meanwhile, Daniel has been somewhat of a spectator toward all of this greatness happening. So Daniel is going to stay steadfast to God, and he's going to remain a man of God through all of this. After King Nebuchadnezzar, we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel chapter 5, we get into a new king. His name is King Belshazzar. It sounds very familiar to the name that King Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel, Belteshazzar. But King Belshazzar is somewhat of a unique figure within this time frame of the Babylonian Empire. Now, I've kind of taken the liberty of outlining Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at these 4 different points for Daniel 5 tonight. Point number 1 is the defilement of the temple, and you don't have to read very far into Daniel chapter 5 to realize how wicked and how evil and corrupt of a king that King Belshazzar was. Now, before we get into Daniel chapter 5, I want us to notice in chapter 5 and verse 1 it says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Here's what's interesting is in chapter 4 we had King Nebuchadnezzar. In secular history, we would jump from King Nebuchadnezzar to King Nabonidus. Now, King Nabonidus was one who came after Nebuchadnezzar, and he was seen as the last king of the Babylonian Empire. In fact, up until the 19th century, people believed that Nabonidus was the last king. However, recent discoveries in archaeology points toward King Belshazzar being the last king of Babylon. So here we find ourselves in an interesting spot of the text in Daniel chapter 5, looking at the last king of Babylon. And in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 4, we see that there is a defilement of the temple. Now, at this point, Jerusalem has already been conquered by the Babylonians. And of course, that's why we have Daniel where he is. He was in exile from Judah, and he's brought into Babylonian captivity. And so it's not that they go back in and defile the temple even more, but rather they have the things of the temple, the golden vessels. And if we keep on reading in chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of the God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised, catch it, the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Again, we get insight into the Babylonian theology that they had gods for everything. They didn't have gods just for gold and silver, but they had gods for iron and bronze. They had gods for wood and stone. It really goes to show that these people were living in a land where they were making gods of everything. And I think we can relate in some way to that, where we have people who are making gods of occupations. That they are taking their occupation and they're setting it above their personal faith in God, maybe in a subconscious way where they're not proclaiming that they do that, but they do it by their actions. We would know verses like Titus chapter 1 and verse 16, where it says they profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. We have these people, certain people of the world, who profess to know God, but by their actions, they are therefore discounting God and his power, and they're putting other things above him. Well, such was the case here in Daniel chapter 5, that they have gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Stone being probably the least of them all, next to wood. I find it interesting that these people were seeking to find gods literally out of everything, out of any building structure. So we see that the opening phrase, or the opening introduction of King Belshazzar is not a good one. We have the defilement of the temple things. And when we look at the book of Hebrews, we note that the worldly things are simply just a shadow of the heavenly things concerning the temple. How there is a real temple in heaven in which God abides in. Now, that doesn't discount for us the holiness and the greatness of the temple of God that was in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that was destroyed and we don't have that temple anymore. You can go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, but it was simply just a western retention wall for the temple. And up on the Temple Mount is now a Dome of the Rock for the Muslims. And so everything that we have for that temple period has been destroyed. And when Jesus comes on the scene in the second temple period, and King Herod builds that and refines it and refurbishes that temple was the one that was also destroyed. So we don't have an earthly temple anymore. However, there is still a heavenly temple. But to the Jews at this time, they've already experienced exile. They've already experienced being pulled from their land, and they've seen their homeland destroyed and the temple of their God destroyed. Now, this king is making a mockery by taking the things of that temple, pouring wine in, and drinking and getting drunk from them in front of thousands of people. Now, in chapter 5, verses 5 through 9, we see a divine message portrayed. Now, this is a very interesting piece of biblical literature for a number of different reasons. I remember teaching this class to some teens up in Conifer, and one student in particular, he was reading this along with me, and his eyes got as big as the moon when he was reading through verse 5. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Opposite the lampstand, and the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now, a very interesting point in scripture where you've got this king and he's having a party. It's a great feast. He's got 1,000 people there. He's got the vessels of the temple that are made of gold with him, and he's drinking from them, defiling the temple. And out of nowhere, literally out of thin air, fingers appear and start writing on the wall. And we'll get to what was written on the wall here in just a moment. But nonetheless, there was writing on the wall, and the king had no clue what it was. In fact, the king was shocked. When we see in verse 6, it says, the king's color changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. He was fearful for what was happening right before him. And likewise, I would be too. If you were sitting there, basking in your glory, and all of a sudden, there appears a hand, no body, no arm, just a hand and fingers that start writing on the wall. That's something out of a modern day horror film. And those words were being written for the king. And then he called loudly in verse 7 to bring the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon. Here's where we have kind of some relationships or some comparisons to King Nebuchadnezzar. He calls all these great wise people of Babylon. And he tells them, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he promises great blessing for whoever can come and tell them what this writing on the wall means. Now, unfortunately, we get to verse 8 and 9, and no one has a clue what the writing means. And they basically tell the king, we don't know what this means. Well, then we get into the third section of Daniel chapter 5, and that's where the queen rises up and tells the king, there's this man who you might be interested in. In chapter 5, verses 10 through 23, we read of Daniel, who is being brought forward. Now, there's a number of things to note here. And the main point is particularly that Daniel's reputation was beginning to be known across the land. And it was beginning to be known no matter who was in the king's spot. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar, the main king that Daniel knew, has been removed from the situation. And we have King Belshazzar, a new king who doesn't know Daniel. But the queen had heard of Daniel. And she says, "O king, there is this man." If you read with me in verse 10, it says, "The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the dining hall, or in the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, 'O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom the spirit of the holy gods, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, made him the chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation.'" Now, mind you, we are still in Babylonian theology, that there are multiple gods being portrayed here, as we saw in chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. And here comes the queen saying, "I've heard of this man Daniel, and you should ask him before asking all your wise men and all those enchanters. Daniel is going to be the one who's going to be interpreting what's written on the wall." And she says, "Because the spirit of the holy God is in him." I find that very interesting, that they are defiling the temple, and it's upon the climax of the king's defilement of the temple that this handwriting starts appearing. And from there, we have Daniel, who's being brought forward to talk about the true God, the one and true God. It's interesting that the timing of God's intervention seems to be pretty consistent. At the point in time that King Belshazzar was getting drunk and defiling all the different vessels of the temple, at the very top of that party is when God intervened. If you remember King Nebuchadnezzar in his pride, it was when he was still speaking that King Nebuchadnezzar fell down to the ground and God spoke to him and humbled him to go and roam around like an ox. And then here comes God's servant Daniel, the one who is resolved in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, who comes forward and who has this reputation of being one in which God's Spirit dwells in. Now, I don't know about you, but as a Christian, I would love to have a reputation among several people, even non-believers, who say, "Oh, that's Tyler. He's the one who has the Spirit dwell in him." Now, whether or not that phraseology will ever come out of anyone's mouth, I highly doubt it. I don't think anyone is going to be walking down the street and be like, "Oh yeah, Tyler, my friend, he's the one whose God's Spirit dwells in." That's a little too far-fetched for our modern day thinking and vocabulary. However, I do believe that there is an aspect found in 1 Peter chapter 3, where there, Peter expresses to give an answer, be ready to give a defense. And why is that? It's because people will start asking you questions based on the life that you live. If you are one who goes through suffering, and if you handle that suffering like a champion and like a saint and hold to God, people are going to start thinking, how is this guy not going to the bars to drown down his sorrows? How is this guy still functioning as a human being, even though all these different things are going on? Certainly we can bring in all sorts of today's scenarios like politics or illnesses or anything into the scenario, and people might start asking questions. How is it that this guy is remaining so calm and peaceful despite the government of our country being so crazy and so out of control? Well, it's because we have Daniel chapter 2 verse 21, that God is ultimately the one who is in control of those governments. And what do we have as an obligation as Christians? Romans chapter 13, to pray for those leaders and to submit to that government. Whoever's in office, whether we agree with them or whether we don't, it is our duty to pray for those who are leading us. Now, that's hard for a lot of us, but we can still have that faith, we can still have that peace and calmness that God is really the true leader, and we can still place our citizenship in heaven and not in this world. Now, moving on, Daniel is the one who has this reputation of being one whose God's Spirit dwells in. But notice the confidence from the queen. Right there in verse 12, at the very end of it, she says, "Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." She isn't flippant about this. She says, Daniel, he's your guy. He'll show you the interpretation for that writing. And then Daniel comes forward in verse 13, and he was brought before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah." Notice what he says, "I have heard of you." Now, this is almost good gossip. Sometimes we take gossip to mean a horribly negative thing, about talking about each other or talking behind someone's back. But talking behind someone's back can also be a good thing. You can praise and lift people up by talking about them behind their back, talking about all their good features, talking about their faith, talking about how righteous they are. Certainly someone had been talking, or a lot of people had been talking about Daniel. King Belshazzar says, "I have heard of you, the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellence, or in excellent wisdom, are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show me the interpretation of the matter." And here's where we get our key word of able again in verse 16. He says, "But I have heard that you can give the interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you should be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in all the kingdom." Now, if we remember Daniel chapter 2 and Nebuchadnezzar, he wanted to know what his dream meant. But he said, if you can interpret the dream correctly, I'll bless you, and if you don't, I'll kill you. And I'll kill a lot of other people. So it seems that King Belshazzar is a little bit more lenient on not being able to interpret this. There's no warning against it. He just says, "I want to know what that writing means." And then I find it really cool in verse 17. Daniel basically stands before the king and he says, "Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another." Daniel's not in this ministry like we looked at here in Daniel chapter 2 through 6, following the ministry of Daniel. Daniel's not in this ministry. Daniel's not a servant for the rewards that come from this life. Daniel's in this to give God glory, and that's something that we need to keep in our minds as well. Verse 18, it says, "O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty." Notice how Daniel always points it right back to God. He says, "O king, your father was so great because God decided to bless him that way. That God put him in that position." Remembering that the most high God is the one who controls all things. And then he kind of starts talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and then in verse 20 he says, "When his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dwelt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him." Again, pride being such a cancer of our spiritual lives that can just eat away at us. Whenever we start to fear or feel prideful, there's tons of biblical examples within the scriptures that show us that that is a horrible spot to be in this life. In verse 22, "And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this." So Belshazzar was very well acquainted with King Nebuchadnezzar and everything that happened with him. And even though he was well acquainted with all of that, King Belshazzar was still leading this prideful life, this life of defiling the temple and to really mock the Jews and to have a great life for himself and really no one else. He didn't care about serving anyone else. And yet he saw King Nebuchadnezzar go through what he did. And he had heard about those things. And yet he wasn't learning from those lessons. It's so hard when we have scriptural examples that we just read and we don't implement them into our lives. That we just read it and we say, "Okay, check mark, I've done my daily Bible reading, I'm moving on," and not incorporating it into our life. That's the whole purpose, is to change our lives. That's what we study the Bible for. That's what we grow to God for, is so that we could be his people and that he could be our God. Now, if we keep on reading in verse 23, kind of at the tail end of verse 23, that's a long verse. But Daniel states something pretty cool. He kind of recalibrates King Belshazzar. He says, "But the God in whose hand is your breath," talking to the king, "and whose are all your ways you have not honored." So again, Daniel really doesn't hold back. He just sticks it to King Belshazzar. He says, "Look, the Most High God, the one who holds all of your life, your ways, your breath, how you function as a human being, the one who holds you in his hand. You have not honored him. And that's Daniel's message to King Belshazzar. And then in verses 24 through 30, we have somewhat of an interesting transition into chapter 6 of Daniel. And this is the idea of Darius the Great being raised up. You can say that either way, but usually the more scholarly way is Darius. Darius the Great is raised up. So if you know your ancient history, Assyria is the one who really antagonized the Jews, and then from Assyria you have Babylon who came in and destroyed Assyria, and then Babylon was feeling awfully mighty of themselves, thinking that they're the greatest kingdom in the world, totally disregarding Daniel's teachings and prophecies. And then from Babylon you have the Medo-Persians who rise up. You've got King Cyrus. If you remember Isaiah chapter 45, Isaiah 45 is a prophecy of Cyrus, how he's going to be a tool in God's hand. And what's really neat about that is Cyrus didn't know God. Cyrus didn't believe in God. However, Cyrus was one who was used in God's will. And that's a really neat idea and concept, that God is going to accomplish his will no matter what, through whoever he wants to. So Cyrus the Mede rises up and destroys Babylon, something that people didn't think was possible, just like Rome. Rome thought they were indestructible, and they got destroyed as well. And then after some time, you have Darius the Great, who gets raised up. And here's what the interpretation boils down to. If you remember from verse 23, Daniel tells King Belshazzar, you have not honored God. Here's what's to follow. Verse 25, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, which means God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. So, not off to a great start, King Belshazzar. That's not the most uplifting prophecy of your part. Verse 27, tekel, you have been weighed and the balance is found wanting. So, there's no justice going on here. You have been corrupt, and you've been corrupt to those who you deal with. Peres, verse 28, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. It's awesome how we have prophecies in the book of Daniel that point to exactly what's going to happen afterward. And what's even cooler is when you get to verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold, and was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean, was killed. Now, again, that prophecy was still a prophecy. It was in the future, but it happened that night. It's to show that prophecies don't have to be several hundred years in advance, but simply the fact that there was a judgment coming upon King Belshazzar. And then verse 31, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So when we look at secular history, Babylon is conquered in 539 BC by the Medo-Persian kind of army at that point. So what do we gather from Daniel chapter 5? Well, we can learn a few lessons, but perhaps one of the greatest is to learn from others. King Belshazzar was extraordinarily close to King Nebuchadnezzar. As we saw, he had heard the stories, he had witnessed what took place. In verse 22 of chapter 5, it says, though you knew all this. So Daniel is teaching him something that he already knew. And yet, because he had heard of all these different bad situations that pride gets you into, King Belshazzar is found in chapter 5, verse 1 through 4, defiling the vessels of the temple. He had no intention to learn from those who made similar mistakes. So, number one, we can learn from others. Number two, it's to show that God is going to get his will done no matter what it takes and no matter who stands in the place. Certainly that was the case for Cyrus as he conquered Babylon. And at this point in the book of Daniel, we are now done with the Babylonians as a nation. And we're going to start moving forward into the Medo-Persian time frame for the book of Daniel. And number three is that your reputation is vital to who you are as a person. There's a quote that says, if all you have is integrity, nothing else matters. If you have no integrity, nothing else matters. Who you are as a human being and as a reputation will promote so many different opportunities in this life and so many other consequences, whether good consequences or bad consequences. Daniel in the land of Babylon, as a Jewish exile who is now in a foreign land, had the reputation of being a person in whom God's Spirit dwelt. I think that says a lot to the man of Daniel and to the ministry of Daniel. Thank you for tuning in. Next week we get into a really cool chapter of Daniel chapter 6, and I'm excited to share it with you.